Welcome to Reformation 2017, Re-Fermenting the Church, Part 3F. My name is Ron Rude. In Parts 3D and 3E, I offered an alternative version of the Christian gospel, that is, in the context of God's 13.7 billion year story of life, God's primary mission, what I think God's story of Jesus is. I suggested that in this fairly new, what I'm calling secondary mission, God's passionate purpose and desire and yearning and project is to try and heal a species gone awry, a species that calls itself, of all things, wise one, or Homo sapiens, a species that is, in fact, infatuated with itself and with the destructive glory and destructive power of Cainism, an anthropocentric narrative that daily puts us more and more out of relationship with our human neighbors, our own inner spirits and souls and selves, with God, and with the multi-layered ecosystems and species diversities of God's beloved and cherished creation, sending us ever more into a vacuous hole that might be best termed a nature deficit disorder, and turning us into Cain conquistadors, and Cain dominators and colonizers, and Cain takers. Anthropocentric divas infatuated with ourselves. And so in God's secondary mission and more recent scriptures called the Bible, in the Old Testament section, God undertakes, as I said last week, a series of healing actions designed to engage and mend our species, including a flood parable, the creation of a chosen people, the Hebrews, their escape from slavery in Egypt, and God then enrolling them in 40 years of wilderness school in the Sinai desert in order to teach them how to live a more excellent, able way. God works through the wisdom of the law and the experiences of the kings of Israel, and through those who have the courage to give voice to God's prophetic word, then and in more recent times, as well as sending countless Abels to try and break through the hardened heart of Cain, including rabbis and people of wisdom and indigenous peoples and those who live on the margins, and especially the strength and grace and wisdom and character implanted by God in the wider community of life. I also suggested in this alternative framing of the gospel that about 2,000 years ago, the one and eternal and holy God, this Lord, this sustainer of the universe, the creator of all that is, seen and unseen, this loving God, decided to come to us in person. And so God emptied self of self and very God of very God. He became a mammal of the species Homo sapiens, that is, Jesus. And I suggested that God didn't enter the human world because we are so special or favored, but because we are the one species that has lost our way. And so this Abel of Nazareth, this incarnate eternal Christ of God, embarked on a mission to seek and to save a lost species with a powerful message. Homo sapiens, you are forgiven. Follow me. And not just follow me as opposed to following someone or something else, but follow me to meet your neighbor, to meet nature, the community of life in God's creation, to meet your own estranged inner spirit and soul and self, and to meet and know the Creator, your Father, your Mother, the one above all others. But we need to know that there are opponents to this embodied mission. There are forces within the human soul working against God's primary mission and against God's secondary mission. Forces that do not want God to succeed. In Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 16, these forces are called the powers and principalities. Sometimes these forces take the form of persons or groups. Other times they are systemic or ideological or cultural. They're spiritual, certainly, and they're often subliminal. However, their tenacious commitment and full-time job is to try to create and maintain a world where relationship impairment flourishes with neighbor, nature, our own inner souls, and with God. We don't often think of this, but relationship impairment with our human neighbor feeds many industries that thrive on conflict, including the alarmist security industries, and the news media and so-called talk radio, which thrives on dysfunction or perceived or made up dysfunction. There are war-making industries that need conflict to stay in business and even grow. And it's not that the individuals that work in these companies are necessarily bad people or degenerates that somehow think that war is a glorious thing, but rather it is the powers and principalities, the systemic beast itself that needs to be fed, that leans God's world in the direction of discord and frankly profits greatly from it. And politics too, or at least the scheming to acquire power, also thrives on dysfunction in obvious ways and subtle ways. Relationship impairment with neighbor is good for all of these industries. Also, relationship with impairment with God's community of life also enhances dishonorable forces in the world, including within our economic system. We've chosen, or stumbled into, a form of capitalism that is Cain-like through and through. And like Jabba the Hutt, Cain never gets enough. So even though as Americans we consume approximately 8 times our share of the world's resources and cause approximately 8 times our share of the world's pollution, even though that's the case, recent politicians and business leaders have been successful in convincing many Americans that somehow we are the ones that are getting a raw deal, that we are being disadvantaged and even cheated. Can you imagine a more perverse and destructive untruth? God's world desperately needs economists and business leaders and MBAs and CPAs and CFOs and CEOs and politicians and local citizens who are committed to building an honorable, able form of capitalism. This is where our brain power needs to go today, but unfortunately about 99% of it is going into Cainism. There are even forces at work that are tooled to perpetuate and increase human emptiness. Why? Because if we are empty, we tend to buy more stuff, thinking this will fill us, and eat more processed and junk food, because junk food leaves a person undernourished with a craving then for more and more. And then we will continue to consume more and more and more forms of entertainment. Entertainment is good, but are we addicted to it? And of course, meds. And finally, relationship impairment with God the Creator feeds the illusion that somehow we own our own lives, or that God has given the earth for us to rule. The powers and principalities always want to sabotage relationships. But it's not just the powers and principalities that oppose God's missions. And here I want to suggest that there are also certain Christian doctrines that in my view need to be reconsidered and maybe even discarded. We will look at these in the next Ron Talk 3G. And after that talk in 3H, I will try to wrap this series up and put it all together in summary form to try and lay out what this alternative version or brew of God's story of life and God's story of Jesus that I don't think is stuck then in medievalism, what that might look like.